Oh.
Ini that
Thank you. Who's this?
my Turkish neighbor is in 72. She puts it on she I mean, it sounds but does explain it. Okay. So you check it. Well, we told her
Oh, suddenly it seems more people here. Heck, magical. This is the room is full. So these are the non-double degree students who had another class or something, is it? Why don't we have them? Awards? He'd got a name, gold. Awards like that. Where are we going to put it?
Now you're in instructions. I'll tell you what, that one, it's outside, but that one, sorry, inside of her.
Yeah, that's inside our area. Needs to be in the foyer.
In the B, for the B. Yeah. The B,
Ah, yeah, in that foyer.
not on the B.
Sorry, it goes loudly. Everyone can hear us talking because we've got the microphone.
You do, like.
Yes, okay, that's a good idea. We'll do that. He's got a life membership at the Castlemate Soccer Club done the other day, though, I noticed.
I'm just gonna mute.
Goals on board.
Oh, she's actually on that club. I thought you said she got a little certificate and she.
She is a life member of Castlemate Soccer Club and now has a gold name on the board. Yes.
I wanted to, when we first went into this area, I was.
Which area?
Where we are.
Not here.
And then. These images, so I think we can hang.
Okay.
And.
Are you going to introduce the class? The first class of the year.
Oh, it is too.
Oh, we kicking off.
Hello, good morning, everyone. So, are you excited to have our guest lecture here this morning? Okay. So let me introduce the guest lecture this morning. So this is Andrew, Professor Andrew Butt.
I don't think it is. How many people are at home?
Eat.
That?
Yeah.
Yeah. So they need to hear us.
Some of them here.
Oh.
Okay. So Professor Andrew Butt is a professor and also associate dean in sustainability and urban planning in the School of Global Urban and Social Studies and the Center for Urban Research at RMIT University, and his research actually focus on rural and regional planning, right, Andrew? And also currently, he has a kind of managing the Smart City Vietnam Hub, something like that, yeah. And then the next guest lecture here, also from RMIT, is Dr. Melissa Neef. Here, she was my PhD supervisor. So Melissa is a senior lecturer in environment and planning program at the RMIT University as well, Australia. And she is actually an environmental geographer at RMIT with experience in natural resource management, especially water resource management, right? And then the last one, but not least here, Dr. Sirin Ho. She is a senior lecturer from University of Melbourne, Australia, from the Geomatic and Land Administration, Infrastructure Engineering, University of Melbourne. Her research focus on governance and or the governance of land tenure and related data, and actually
Yeah, but the class is and even on the development management. So that we can start lecture with various topics. So, prepare a presentation about presentation about urban tip island and experience land data management. Yeah. Okay. So who is going to start first? Andrew.
Oh, I go first. All right.
So over to you, Andrew.
Thanks a lot. I've got to work out how to make this so I can share it.
Yeah, you must share.
Yeah, how's going to make that? Oh, there we go.
Yeah.
It's fine.
You can use this.
Yeah, that's good. All right. Thanks, Sri, for the introduction to, can everyone hear me? Is that okay? Thank you for the introduction. Yeah, as Sri said, I'm Andrew. I'm a professor of urban planning at RMIT in Melbourne. And you've asked me to talk a bit about smart cities, but I'm kind of not actually. I'm going to talk about other stuff, but that's okay. I actually wanted to talk about the fact that the sort of work I do around development and infrastructure planning in Australian cities, but also some examples of how we might think about using data, particularly sort of, burgeoning ideas like a smart city as a repository of useful analytics for thinking about the city, and then thinking through what might be wrong with that. And so I'm going to give a really short sort of presentation about some of the ways we use data and some of the limitations it presents. And then if we can lead on to talking about the other examples here, perhaps we can have a conversation then about what can spatial data offer us and what dilemmas does it present for us to use? How do we discern between data which is useful in different contexts? And then maybe hopefully we can have a discussion later about the ways in which we should be trying to use the huge amounts of spatial data that are out there now from various forms and various sources in the sorts of decisions that we might need to make cities more sustainable. I suppose if that's a fundamental idea we might have for what we're all here for. So I've titled it Smart Cities, How Should We Use Data in Decision Making? Talk a bit about Australia, but I'm not just going to talk about Australia. And I was going to talk about Vietnam, but I'm not necessarily either. Just as Sri said, I'm part of a research hub with RMIT in Vietnam, where we're particularly looking at smart, sustainable cities issues. And of course, the context there is quite different about how data is used and operationalized, particularly by government. So we can reflect on some of those things later as well. So the things I wanted to talk about was firstly, what do we mean by smart cities, and I'm thinking about what they mean. And by that, I'm thinking particularly about the increasing numbers of people who hold data in different sources and have and what people's motives are to think about smart city data, think about data that we use to try and tell us about human behaviours within cities, or tell us about how systems, both human and non-human, operate in cities, and what we should do with that information. And here I'm thinking about all sorts of things like, what are people's travel behaviours, or how does infrastructure operate? Where do we need more of something or less? Who decides, and what might be the criteria for that? Because at the end of the day, all of that information is still just information that we then have to make judgments about, that are cultural and social and economic and political judgments. So the problem with the ubiquity, the amount of data we now have at our fingertips, is that it often leads us to think it can help us it can in fact make decisions for us. But I'm arguing in this that maybe we've got to then be much more discerning, a lot more discerning, in fact, about how to use information and what the motives for people wanting to use particular information might be. So then I wanted to talk a little bit about lessons from Australia, but I was going to make a diversion via Bangkok to get there. So this is the point I was making, I suppose. We've got data for making decisions. We've got a lot more data for making decisions. And in some ways, you could think, I mean, if you want to think historically about this, we're getting to a point where I feel we're returning to many of the very comprehensive data-driven decision-making, which was a feature of urban planning back 50 years ago or more, where an idea that somehow if we just knew everything about city systems or transport, we would make the right decisions for cities. And I think a lot of planners around the world over the last 50 years have realised that's probably not going to work, that in fact there's a lot more to it that are about individual behaviour, about what sort of motives or pressures we put on people to do certain things in certain ways, whether that's about how they use resources or how they travel in the city or where they live, or all those sorts of factors. But now we've got such easy access to lots of spatial data, there's a tendency to go back and rely on that again. That's a trend I'm arguing we're seeing. And so I'm going to talk a little bit about indicators of healthy cities as an idea to talk to us about something which I think is a good motive. And I do some work with that space on a couple of projects. And I think it's a good motive. It's a thing we should be looking for, health and well-being, and how to make cities healthier places to live. But I also think sometimes we can be led by the data rather than led by the ideas we have about what we're trying to achieve in health and well-being in cities. And so that's where I think we need to think cautiously about how we use information. And that's a challenge I'm putting to all of you as you do a course like this one, to think about what should we be thinking about in decision making, what information should we use, and how do we be discerning about that information and the ways in which we'd use it. So I'm going to look at the example of livability. I'm going to look at research programs that explore policy impact based on things like indicators, as in ways to sort of rationalize down information to a series of simple kinds of measures that we can use and map, that are really good tools for us to use, but come with different problems. They come with problems of scale. How do we represent things at scales that make it easy for people to understand that it relates to them? Are people individuals, or do they just live in neighbourhoods, or do they just live in much larger sets? How do we tell things about people from that information? The idea of agency and the choices people make. So if we know something about an environment that makes people healthier because there's less pollution or more shade or whatever it might be, and some of the factors we're talking about here, how do people make their own choices to actually maximise that? What choices do they have in the environment they live in? And the last one is, of course, the quality of data itself. So we've got so much data, but it's often hard to read the quality of that information, and how useful it is, how fit for purpose it is for that job at hand. So these are maps of Australian cities from some project work I did a few years ago with others that tell us about the places in the pink. And again, the maps aren't that meaningful, right? So if you think about it, a place like Melbourne, where I'm from, is the second from the right on the top. And, you know, that's an expanse of across from one end to the other of close to 100 kilometres of a metropolitan region. But the main story there is all the pink stuff's in the middle, where people have got good access to public transport options and good access to walkable suburbs and good access to older infrastructure, and all the places that are in blue are on the fringes where people are living in environments that are poorly serviced. That's the story. And so what does that mean? And I suppose on one level, it indicates that if you could, you live in a place that's well serviced and you get a healthier environment. And if you can't, you live in a place that's blue and you get a less healthy environment. But of course, you know, there's also a whole range of factors within that. Certain decisions have been made in this data to decide some things are healthier things than others. And many of the people living in those different environments might not agree with them. They might actually feel that living on the fringe of the city, close to nature, but having to drive everywhere is a perfectly reasonable decision for them to make compared to living in another environment where there's more air pollution. They might trade one thing off for the other based on what they can afford, what they're willing to pay. All the data that we've developed there is fed through a set of assumptions about how to reduce down indicators of health and well-being in a city, and also assuming certain things about people's behaviours and choices that can't easily be made. So you know, if this is to become a policy decision-making framework, what should it tell us? In Melbourne at the moment, it's being taken to mean shove more people into the pink parts because they're good environments for people to live in and discourage people living on the fringes. That's the policy idea at work. But of course, that risks making some of those areas in the middle less healthy to live in because they're overcrowded and the like, and less accessible because of the affordability of housing, for example. So in fact, the policy prescription for the diagnosis of the city might not be the best one. And equally, of course, there's choices made about what data goes in and what comes out to make that decision. And so, you know, I'll put my hand up and say I'm guilty of being part of that process. And while we might decide that there's background literature and logic to what we do, none of that's ever flawless. And we're making decisions, or at least attempting to make policy impact that affects individuals' decision-making, you know, and the decisions people make through some fairly abstracted and large-scale citywide data decisions, which is always troubling and always should trouble all of us in planning. So there's a closer map of that. And so the website then is the Australian Urban Observatory, which is a health and wellbeing indicator model that we run at RMIT, and the green's good and the pink's bad, basically, in that model. The central Melbourne is, the people who can see on the map, central Melbourne's around here, and this is sort of leading out into the suburban areas. And when you look at this map again with some of Mel's stuff, I don't know if you've got some maps of this, you might note some things about, you know, urban greening and shade and cooling and the very different environments that some people live in compared to others when it comes to something quite clear and physical like shade and access to summer cooling, which is an issue, a challenge in a city like Melbourne. And that's got socioeconomic dimensions, and it's got issues about accessibility to a range of different kinds of options in the city. And this map here kind of also follows a model of a basic socioeconomic map of the city. So that tells us about choice and agency. So what would the policy response be? Well, it could be to say, let's improve the pink areas, or it could be to say, let's drive everyone to live in the green areas because they're better. That might not be a good one. I'm not sure why I had that. That was an accident. So I was also going to talk about then some work that my colleagues did in that other, who did in other work, taking the same model to Bangkok. And the challenge in Bangkok, of course, was that the assumptions people made about what are indicators of health and well-being are quite different, because clearly they're highly contextualized in place. What people understand to be a good living environment, what choices people have about housing and transport, what sort of decisions people make about what benefits they get and what they tolerate are very different. So this work was done with local, not necessarily with communities, but certainly with local level government agencies in Bangkok to try and look at some of the issues around density, around the presence of vegetation in the city, and around levels of pollution, the bottom one, for different districts. So the levels of pollution, for example, is not necessarily a significant, it's a significant issue in Melbourne, but it's not one people would identify immediately as being a livability indicator, because there's very few places where levels of air pollution are intolerable or demonstrably unhealthy, at least at a larger scale, particularly when compared to other cities like Bangkok, cities in South Asia. So the idea that you need to then contextualize that information is pretty important. How do you do it? Well, you probably don't do it by just reproducing the same model in different places around the world. And so then again, one of the fundamental problems with things like indicator models like this is the availability of consistent data across different cities, and also the level of detail that exists within some of these big blocks, you know, where you might have the same data or quite large neighbourhoods where you can't actually tell much difference between things like, for example, air quality. If you look at the bottom map, the air quality data is pretty fluid, if you like, and liminal, whereas it's been reconstructed to code very detailed neighbourhoods to have a particular level. And of course, that's not the experience of air quality at all. It's going to vary differently just over a few hundred metres from particular transport sources and the like. And so, you know, that becomes really challenging to think about how we can use information like that. And of course, you know, this is an Australian policy brief on livability. I won't go through it necessarily, but it focuses on things like walkability in neighbourhoods. You know, that's seen to be a high level indicator of how walkable is a neighbourhood. What does that even mean? And what would it mean in the context of Yogyakarta? You know, is walkability about climate? Is it about locations? Is it about the quality of infrastructure? Is it something even people are desiring to do? In an Australian city, it probably is. People would feel if they could get around the neighbourhood safely and walk places, that would be a good indicator of quality in their neighbourhood. But that might not be one that people at all believe and understand in other cities. So there's a high sense of context mattering in this regard. And this is an example where this is presented, at least in Australian context, as being a most obvious indicator of livability. And I don't believe that it necessarily would be in other locations. And even when we talk about urban density here, it's a very Australian context of what urban density looks like, what household formation looks like, all those sorts of things which are very particular to different places, even within a country like Indonesia. So the problems here, I suppose what I see is that notion of what roles we put for these data. You know, we talk about them as informing policies, as smart cities data, whether it's data collected by people using using Google Maps like a proprietary set, or whether it's collected by government, or whether it's measured through, an Internet of Things traffic counter. What's it for? We think it's about informing policy or influencing people, or is it for testing data and scenarios? Think what would happen if we did something else? They're all legitimate things that you might think about in this class to try and do with data. And sometimes we've got problems about what is it from now or is it from in the past? How do we use it? What do What are we using it for? What do we think would change if people change their behaviour? There's that big problem of it mattering and being particular to locations. And it's very hard to just pick data that even might be universally available, like commercially available data on big platforms, global platforms like Google. Excuse me, I'm just going to have some tea. And actually use it in different places and assume it tells you the same thing. Because it very likely doesn't. And of course, it masks a lot of information about why people make choices. So the challenge there is often it tells us what people do, but it doesn't tell us what they'd prefer to do. And that's a real problem with a lot of the data-driven decision-making, that why people are making decisions is fundamental, and often and what sort of decisions would they prefer to make is often hidden in that assumption that somehow people are acting as rational agents in all the decisions they make. And of course, it's that bigger challenge that we had right back in the sort of rational comprehensive models of planning in the 1960s, which was somehow that the city was just a set of visualized facts. Now, if you got all the data, you could see exactly what the city was. And that was the shortcoming of the rational comprehensive planning that we saw in, permeating so many places, including Indonesian cities in the 1950s, 60s and 70s, where data-driven decision-making about urban motorways, about housing developments and all those things, about dealing with water and flooding was all driven by data in ways that failed to recognise essential features of how those things really operated in the city and at local level. And for me, one of the fundamental problems is we know lots of information, but we also have that challenge of when and how we can constitute it as real evidence in a way that can make an argument. So how do we turn information into something which offers evidence for decision making? Because information is not necessarily useful policy evidence. It's just information, and there needs to be work around it to think through what it does tell us and what it doesn't. So I was going to talk a little bit about what we're doing here today, but I'm going to run out of time. I think part of the issue for us in thinking about, how we learn about this and how we do research about it as academics and students at present is that, we want to tell people about data. We want to learn to use data. We want to become data analysis of the urban. That's what we should be doing. We should be thinking about how to use this information, how to use it well. But we've got that trap of falling into the pattern of just wanting to play with maps. Okay, that's great, but always think about what's behind that. What's it for? How would you use it to make change? Because that's what you really want to do, right? You want to make change in the city. There's that issue of the limitations and frustrations of just presenting lots of information and no one understanding it. That's a classic problem for anyone in this area. Like, just look at the map; it tells you what we should be doing. And I suppose that's a challenge for your students to recognise that you'll hit frustrations when you think you've got something which is obvious evidence of how we should do things and it doesn't happen. There's lots of things to use from different data sources. There's so much information out there that you can use, and it's not just about formal information coming from institutional government data sources, but just simple things that you can see on your phone tell you about behaviours, but just be wary of them. Think about what they really are. And of course, you need to kind of do formal kind of work with all this, but also you can, as you can see, there's so many information sources on the internet of just people telling you interesting things about information. So be willing to think about what they are, but take them with some caution when you want to use them in some of your own thinking and analysis of what you assume to be happening in cities today. There's some references, but I'll ditch that, and we can talk more about it later. But I'll pass across to you. Who? Mel? Okay.
Any questions?
Yeah, has anyone got any questions now? Do you want to do it at the end? So that was by way of an introduction of saying there's lots of information, but think carefully about it. which I think it's timely because it's so easy to get hold of such rich sources of information at a global and local scale. And I think it can be overwhelming, and it can also mask some of the real questions we need to ask. That was my challenge to you. Yeah, sure, unless someone's got a question, but you can hold them till later.
I gotta stand up to do this. I feel very jet lagged
please.
today. No, it's all right. I'll just, can you hear me online? I'll take that as a yes, I guess. Good morning. It's great to be here. Sorry, I changed the title as well, Sri. I think I gave Sri a title under pressure. So I guess it's a little bit connected to what Andrew's just said. And I just want to touch on some fundamental concepts about land data that I've seen kind of rise in significance in development work. And I'll talk a little bit more about what I do. But first, I guess, I just wanted to get a sense of what you understand to be what land data is. Any ideas? What's land? Just when you see those words, what kind of data do you think about? Place? Yeah. Big place, more? Sorry? Yeah. So administrative boundaries or something. Yeah. Anyone else? Minerals? Yes. Underground, above ground. Yeah. So land cover, maybe land use. Anything else? Yes. What kind of data would go into that? Yeah, so maybe value or yeah. All right, cool. And anything else? Anything very personal? What's a personal kind of land data? Yeah, ownership. Yeah. So whether you can live where you live, right? So this is basically when what I'm going to talk about is kind of what you would understand as property data or land data, the right to be somewhere. And typically, just to give you a bit of background, because I did like 10 slides and I realized, oh no, maybe you won't have any idea about what I'm talking about. So I'll just run through a little bit of background. So I sit within a geomatics engineering faculty, where we, like with all good engineers, we like to measure and build stuff. So we measure the world, basically is what we do. And we build now digital infrastructures that hold that data so that it can be used. So very similar to what Andrew was talking about in terms of smart cities. When it comes to land and property data, our fundamental building block is the land parcel. And basically what we like to collect and measure stuff about is the geography of it, so the spatial information about it. But we also like to collect information about who lives there and what they use it for and what they can't use it for. So makes sense, right? The problem with this is that a lot of this is collected by governments. This is a government data set. So for the public administration students in the class, this is a core and really old function of governments, right? And we have Napoleon to thank for it, for the modern art of property registers and land registers. We have the lovely Napoleon to thank for it. The problem with this is that because it is a state function and requires a lot of capacity, there's been a kind of a driving myth, and it's probably, the stats have probably increased a little bit, that a lot of countries and a lot of governments around the world don't actually have this data, or they don't have it in digital form, which means we can reuse it for lots of different things. So what this means is that it's become a key source of borrowing for governments. It's become a key source of, it's become like a fundamental step in many development projects, that land reform or land data gathering, that fundamental block of land data is what we do in some, to precipitate things like infrastructure development, agricultural reform even. So so land administration, the term is really referring to the state's art of collecting, processing, managing this data. So whenever you see the word land administration, really, you have to go straight to the state's function. And a lot of this has, because of that gap in this data, it's been a key source of lending. So I put up there the World Bank is a major source of lending. And that's about 10% of the money that goes into these projects around the world. So there's other funders as well. The problem with this is that most of these projects, when they collect the data, and I'm just using an evaluation of the bank's own projects, is that it's not inclusive. It doesn't actually capture vulnerable groups, or it actually makes their lives worse because it dispossesses. The core argument about it is that land is power, land is wealth. And when you put a boundary around something, you're basically drawing a line between someone who wins and someone who loses. So you're creating a system of people who have and who don't have, right? Although it's sometimes framed as a system of managing a scarce resource. But when push comes to shove, we have a system of people who can afford to have land and who can't. So this is the theory of change. When we work in development, you often hear these words, theory of change. What do we do? What are the sets of steps we need to put together to have outputs and outcomes? So the set of steps when it comes to land projects is that we often start with land policy or law, a new law that says we can collect this data, or we create new ways of spatializing this data. So there's new codes around it. And that leads us to a new process of surveying. So we get that formal documentation. When we talk about formal stuff, we're really talking about data that's held by states. And then we make this magnificent leap to the fact that once we have this data, we can meet all sorts of human rights. And this will lead to state outcomes and individual outcomes. And it all sounds glorious and magnificent. And it's been given a lot of credibility by the Sustainable Development Goals, particularly because it is an indicator. Land titles are an indicator in goals 1 and 5. So suddenly we have this normative kind of push to, oh no, I have to get this data. I have to have this data. And because we now have mature and cheap technologies, we've seen lending in this space ramp up since 2016. So about a fifth or a sixth of the bank's total kind of lending has been since 2016 around the use of digital technologies and data. And the lovely government of Indonesia is a key borrower. You've borrowed $240 million to do the One Map project, sitting behind a motivation of agrarian reform. So this is kind of what my kind of the work I do. This is the ecosystem of the work I do. And a lot of the purpose and the marketability of digital land data is that it can be used to inform all sorts of decision-making to support human rights. And this comes back to the rise of the rights-based doctrines since the 2000s. So this is kind of some of the examples where they suddenly make this leap of faith between land data and human rights outcomes. So these are just some of the examples: poverty, resilience, women's rights, so on and so forth. So that's kind of the background. And basically, I've worked in this space since I finished my PhD, which was in 2016. And I tend to work in developing countries where we're trying to understand how the use of these data and technologies work and what impact it actually has. So I just wanted to touch on two things that I think as young people going into development work or who might go into development work, these are some things that you will need to think about because they're kind of the zeitgeist we're in. And the first thing I want to talk about is the concept of digital justice or digital injustice when we start to use these kinds of data. And I'll use one of the projects that I work in and continue to work in the state of Odisha in India, which is that darker gray bit on the eastern coast on the Bay of Bengal, where there's been what is arguably the world's largest slum formalization project. It started in 2017 with the passing of a law that only took 9 days. And if you know anything about laws passing, 9 days is incredibly miraculous. What's been sold about this project is that, oh, we're going to do it really rapidly, really cheaply using drones. Yeah, so, and household surveys. So, okay, we're going to have that, these complete digital data sets, which is very good. They've got a lot of outcomes. And the thing with data is that it lends itself to metricization of evaluation. When you evaluate a digital a development project, you need numbers, right? Because the funder always wants to know the return on investment. So in this project, it was excellent. You know, the numbers look really healthy. They've won 2 global awards within the span of 4 years. It all looks really shiny. It looks very aspirational. We should all be following Orissa. And, you know, there's this kind of rhetoric that says, you know, yes, we have this high precision, high accuracy imagery, and it really helped us to develop trust with the slum dwellers. And so, you know, it was working really well. And that was true in a lot of cases. But when we went to communities and we had a chat to about 8 communities in 4 different locations, representing the variations in the extent of titling in those communities, most had didn't know anything about the drones. They kind of maybe saw it, maybe didn't. But because of the technique of flying the drone, lots of small houses couldn't really, and they use pixel-based data feature extraction. So a lot of small houses weren't mapped. Anything under trees were missed out. If you've ever been to an informal settlement, you know the houses are small. People spend a lot of time outside. Women cook outside, bathe the children outside. So all those spaces were no longer documented because we're drawing our data from household surveys. So all those spaces in the blink of an eye just became rendered invisible. And actually, no community had a copy of the map. And no community, about half our communities did not actually see the maps when they were participating in the household survey. So they couldn't locate themselves in the space. So when we talk about concepts of justice, we usually talk about 3 things: whether things are distributed equally, whether the procedure is fair and accountable, and whether your rights are recognized. So in terms of recognition of justice, we found lots of issues, and I just put up there an example of a quote where between the survey and the drone, they completely changed people's addresses from one village to another. And what that means for a vulnerable family is that your ration card, because everything in India is linked to an address, everything they had to go and engage in the bureaucratic procedure of changing everything over, pay the funds. And so we go, oh, why didn't you complain? And then they went, yeah, we did. But they said, it's recorded, it's done, we can't change it. So there's kind of this disconnect that we saw on the ground between an efficient, you know, there's such a drive for an efficient, quick, cheap process that there was such a reluctance to change it once there were errors. And there were other errors as well that I'll come to in a little bit. One of the big things about land reforms is that they redistribute land. So one of the things we found that many of our communities had their existing house areas rapidly reduced, drastically reduced. So I put down there a quote because that's it wasn't uncommon. I think most families had their, especially, and this was the interesting thing, the reduction tended to be more visible in lower caste communities. So there's something there about the power imbalance and the ability to advocate for their rights that we saw happening in the poorest of the poor communities. And really, it was a real frustration for families who had spent a whole generation slowly eking out space in these settlements to suddenly have it reduced to basically the size of a room. And if you know what 30 square meters is, it's smaller than the space. It's kind of a bit smaller than the space here. And often we saw multiple families. The thing that troubles me, I think, with the work in India and the rapid adoption of technologies, and the new one for them is the use of AIs and facial recognition, is that a lot of these algorithms are based on Western faces. My face, your face, their faces might be all right, but our faces will not register really well, right? So in a lot of these technologies. So there's kind of lots of issues embedded in the algorithm that we can't even begin to unpack or understand how they impact us. And that's where some of the concern is in development, because it isn't in white people's spaces, right? It's kind of in brown people's spaces, yellow people's. So there's just lots of issues that we don't teach you in the classroom. We don't kind of get you to think about until you are working in the space, and then you kind of go, oh no, you know, what the hell is going on here? So that's kind of the first thing that I really wanted you to at least to take away. The second thing is around the link between land data and climate actions. And this is work that we did recently for the bank, which was very interesting. And we crunched through a lot of data that was captured in the nationally determined contributions. So I don't know if this is familiar to you. Anyone heard of nationally determined contributions? So any country that's a signatory to the Paris Agreement will have to put out every 5 years what they commit to do at a country level to reduce their carbon emissions and their carbon footprint. So this data was based on the 2000 round of submissions. Another round is due this year, so we'll see what happens. And we looked at the data for 40 countries in East Asia and Southeast Asia and the Pacific and South Asia regions. So that's a weird geographic clustering. I'm not quite sure why they called that. But before we did this work, colleagues at the University of Melbourne had already published a report called the Land Gap Report, where they looked only at nationally actions that prioritize carbon dioxide removal. So a lot of this was forestry-based stuff. And they found that the actions committed, it was equivalent to committing to needing 1 billion hectares of land, which is 5 times the size of Indonesia. So, and we don't have that land. You know, a lot of land is occupied, right, by something or someone. So, and they found that 50% of these pledges that related to reforestation or afforestation, which is a good thing, won't need land use change. But what are we going to do to the people who live on that land? So when we looked at the data in a little bit more closely, we found that about 1 in 2 of climate actions in general, across all the sectors, across mitigation or adaptation actions related to land, and you can see that dark green component is what we call direct land actions, which means it will either change the land use component of it, or it will change someone's access to that land. So about 40%, so that was the statistic. We found that about 40% will directly impact land. And in East Asia and the Pacific, and you can see Indonesia's colored between 40 to 60% there. This is the proportion of climate actions that would directly impact land. And so when I just looked a little bit more closely at Indonesia's actions, very few actions specify, quantify a footprint. And so these were 3 actions that Indonesia actually had quantified footprint. And actually already amounts to about 14% of land area in the country. So it's really what we're concerned about is that that these decisions are being made at very, very high levels about land that somebody lives on or somebody uses to secure their life and livelihoods. And we're not sure where we're going to put these land actions because we don't have the data, or we don't have the right types of data, because we only collect data about legal land rights. We don't collect data often about indigenous land rights or customary land rights or religious land rights. We don't collect a lot of data about women's land rights, even though we commit to it. And we certainly don't or can't collect data that we have no right to know, especially amongst indigenous groups. So it's deeply problematic that we're making decisions based on very limited understanding of what is going on land. So of course, our indigenous peoples around the world have been very vocal about their rights and their impact on them. I think every year, a lot of environmental and land defenders have died trying to protect their land, and that was the article on the right. But this graph here shows the number of land grabs that have happened since the 2000s. And you can see that with the rise of sustainable development agendas, land grabs have actually increased, and they certainly increased over COVID. So I put some links up there as well for you to go and have a look at. This is out of a really excellent report called Uneven Ground. But I guess what I wanted to leave you with is to consider when you go into development work, to think about what constitutes an infrastructure of knowledge. What do you already know? What is wrong with what we know? What do we want to know? And do we actually need to know those things? And in the spaces where you work with Indigenous groups, where you can't know certain things, how do you understand how to work with that kind of knowledge systems? And this is stuff nobody ever teaches you in class, right? Because we just can't. You have to be in context, in doing development work to actually understand it. And it's not, I would say it's not just working in rural areas or with people who live in forests. A lot of the work we do in India, a lot of this is urban, so it's situated in the urban context. And certainly in the Pacific Islands as well. So I'll leave you with that to try to think about what is an infrastructure of knowledge when you start to work in development. And hand over to Mel. Unless there are questions, but we can take questions at the end. Should sit here so that right? Oh, yes.
Okay, thanks, Serene and Andrew. We'll change tack completely now. Why is mine not doing that? Oh, maybe I need to be in Zoom. No, I need to be in Zoom. I see. Oh. I can't see it in Zoom. But this is what I did. Yeah. Yeah, that's what I did. Gonna go funky for a second. Is that working? Oh, because I didn't pick it. Yeah, and then we do this, right? And then hopefully that will work. Yeah. Okay. Okay. Thanks everybody. Sorry. So yes, my name's Melissa, and I guess it is quite difficult to follow up what both Andrew and Serene have been talking about, because I thought what I would talk about is something like a bit of an example of using data and thinking about the way we use data in cities, and well, in particular, I'm interested in heat in cities. And so my background's in physical science, even though I'm in the School of Global, Urban and Social Studies. I like rivers, and I like the environment. And for me, it's less about people and justice and more about environmental protection. And that has its own problems. But, you know, so when Andrew's talking about livability in downtown Melbourne, I'm thinking that doesn't sound livable to me. I would rather live out in the bush, to be honest. And so it's a different kind of consideration of the city. So I'm going to talk about heat in cities, and really it's just a bit of a short conversation around how we might think about heat, how we measure heat in cities, and some of the work that I've done recently. The image that you're looking at there is actually tourists going to Pompeii, to the famous site in Italy. And you might see they're all lined up there on the right-hand side of the image. And that's because it was stinking hot. And they're not forced to be over there. They're desperately seeking shade, right? So cities are this, you know, are these, they're just places where it gets so incredibly hot. And how do we manage to survive in these environments? And importantly, how are we going to survive into the future is the sort of thing that we need to be thinking about. So if we think about where people live, we know at the moment that it's something like 56% of the global population lives in cities. And this is expected to increase to 70%. So populations are growing and the number of people in cities is growing as well. So there's more people on the world, on the planet by 2050, but there's also increasingly more people in cities. So that's a picture of Tokyo, the most populous city in the world at the moment, getting up to about 60 million, 58 million, something like that in greater Tokyo. In a couple of years, it's expected that Delhi will overtake Tokyo as the biggest city in the world. So Andrew was talking about livability and Serene was talking about rights, and you've got all of these people in this area living together and enacting their lives. And then they're sharing it also with other components of the landscape, with organisms and rivers, which I think of rivers as organisms as well, to be honest. And so you're trying to survive in this area where there's so many people and so much going on. And, you know, you want to be content in your urban environment. And how do you achieve that? But here's the thing about cities. You all know this. I don't think I need to tell you. Cities get hot, like really hot, okay? So that's some work from Jakarta, some images of Jakarta. And up the top, you can see it's some depiction of urbanization around Jakarta. So Jakarta has been growing in size, as all cities have, because urbanization is increasing. So Jakarta's growing in size. And then if you look at the bottom three images, they're images of heat in Jakarta. And where we see the city expand, we see heat increasing. Because cities get hot. That's the reality of the urban landscape in which we live. And you no doubt all know this term of urban heat islands, right? So this is where a city gets hotter than its adjacent non-urban region. And they're always depicted by little graphs that look like this. But although that's a fairly simple representation, it's actually a really good representation of what's happening in cities. But because you can see in the center of the city, the temperatures are highest. And then as you move away from the city and out towards the edges, the temperatures tend to get lower, tend to decline. So the reason this happens is there's really three, I'm distilling it down very simply to three things. Pollution. When we live in cities, we put all sorts of pollution into the atmosphere, and that pollution helps to trap heat. But some of that pollution is heat as well, because of the things that we do that generate heat. So some of it's about the fact that we actually heat up the city's environment. What a surprise that it's hotter. The second reason is because of the shape of cities. Cities are, and so this is a very much limited to design, engineering, planning, and ideas around how a city should be, the form of the city. So we can set cities up to have airflow move more efficiently through the city, or move better through the city, I guess, for want of a better term, or we can set cities up so that they just trap heat and they're hot and they never cool down. So it has to do with the form of the city. And then really the final thing, which is the thing that I'm most interested in this conversation, is what the city is made of, the surfaces that comprise the city. And cities tend to be constructed of materials that absorb and store heat better than natural surfaces. So not surprisingly, as you look at that image, in the city where you have the peak, the high temperatures, you've got tall buildings that are trapping heat, and not only trapping it, storing it and holding that heat. And the problem with that is overnight, never cools down. So the city stays hotter overnight than the adjacent rural area or non-urban area. As you move away from the city, you see the buildings becoming lower, not as high. You see more vegetation coming into the environment. So the composition of the surface means more heat energy is reflected, the albedo changes, and the heat is not absorbed but is sent back into the atmosphere, and it's cooler. But also wind can move through, and it's not as hot. So this sets up the urban heat island effect, and it's a very common effect. And I'll just say we have known about urban heat islands for hundreds of years. So I'm not telling you something new. And many, many people work on urban heat islands and thinking about how we might live in cities, given that they're heating up, that they are so hot. So the image on the left there is Melbourne. And that's a heat vulnerability index for the city of Melbourne. So Andrew put up an image of livability in the city. And this is almost the exact reverse of it, because downtown Melbourne has a much higher heat vulnerability index than further out. And that's not surprising, because I've just explained to you, downtown Melbourne, tall buildings, lots of concrete, bitumen that stores heat, keeps it overnight, never cools down in the hot weather. But as you go further out, more vegetation, the city opens up, airflow is better. And so the city is a little bit cooler. Now, there are other things that control heat. So it's not just about the urban form. But what's really interesting about Melbourne is the places that are the hottest are closest to the water. You would expect water to moderate heat, right? In other words, water should keep things a little bit cooler. So that's actually cooled down a little bit even by the presence of water in the harbour. In other words, we're lucky that we're not an inland city. It would be hotter still. The data on the right there are some urban heat data that we've collected over the years. And what you'll see there is that Melbourne's average urban heat island is around 2 degrees Celsius, 2.31 degrees Celsius. So what that means is kind of on average, the city is about 2 degrees Celsius than adjacent non-urban areas. And you'll see that for most of the time, the city is hotter than the rural areas. So 90% of the time, Melbourne's hotter than adjacent non-rural areas, right? There's nothing new here. It's a pretty standard urban heat island location. It's actually not as extreme as some places in the world. We do have some days where Melbourne can be 10 degrees Celsius or hotter than the non-urban areas, but we're not too bad. Our heat island is present, but it's not too bad. But here's the problem. It's not just that cities get hot. It's that when cities get hot, that's bad for us, right? This is not a good situation to live in a hot city. So as cities are problematic because of this storage of heat within them. This heat threatens human health and it disrupts ecosystems. I'm not going to talk about ecosystems today, but I could. I could give you lots of examples of fish kills in cities, or in Australia, when we have heat waves, bats die. And bats are a critical, see, I'm already talking about it. I said I wasn't going to talk about it, then here I am. But bats are critical pollinators, or insects die and they're critical pollinators. So heat is deadly not just to humans, but of course, most of our focus is around humans because that's what we're mostly interested in. So what we know is that hot cities threaten humans. And in Australia, we experience more deaths in association with heat than all other natural disasters combined. Now, that's partially because we don't have cold. if you've not been to Australia, it's not a snowy country. Like there's only a few places that get snow and they're getting increasingly less snow. But in Australia, so in a place like the US, for example, they'll have both heat causing death, but also winter cold conditions causing death. For us, we just have heat. So heat should be a really important driver for our consideration of how we manage and plan our cities, because that is the big kind of killer in Australia in many ways. And so really interestingly, and this was some work that was done a few years ago, if the temperature in the city gets to 30 degrees Celsius, you see a 10% increase in hospital visits, right? So the point of putting that number up there is to indicate that we're not talking about heat becoming a threat at 50 degrees Celsius. It's a threat at 30 degrees Celsius, right? So it's important to recognise that it doesn't have to be this extreme heat that's going to result in this. And then the second number there is 27 degrees Celsius for 3 days. So if you have 3 days in a row that have temperatures in excess of 20 degrees Celsius, hospital visits, and this is specifically for cardiovascular illness, hospital visits increase to nearly 38% or increase by nearly 38%. So again, temperatures, bad for human health, right? Irrespective of all the problems with other organisms. Now here, on top of this, doesn't matter what's going on temporally. So this is a spatial problem. Cities jammed in together, or where people are jammed in together gets hotter, but this is compounded by climate change. We know temperatures are increasing globally. We know this. This is not debatable. We know it. The evidence tells us it's happening. And the consequence of this is that we're getting days in excess of 30 degrees Celsius more frequently than we used to. And that image on the right there comes from the most recent State of the Climate report that's put out by the Bureau of Meteorology in Australia. And like, it is fascinating. It's a representation of extreme heat events in Melbourne, and events that used to occur 2% of the time now occur 11% of the time. So we've seen a steady increase in high heat events within Australia, and that's compounded in cities because cities are already hot, and so they're getting hotter still, and this is a problem. So how do we come about understanding heat in cities, and how does data help us to interpret it, I guess, is kind of what I thought I might dwell on a little bit. So this is a pretty standard representation of temperature distribution across the city of Melbourne. So that's a remotely sensed infrared image, okay? So it's recording data and it's telling us what the temperatures are, and the temperatures are surface temperatures. So you've got the city there, you've got the harbour, and then you can see variations with the darker colour being, I think it goes up to about 40 degrees Celsius, it's hard to read, 40 degrees Celsius, and a few places where it's blue, those are down in the 20 degrees Celsius. So there's this great data source available for looking at temperatures in city, which is remotely sensed imagery. And this is becoming increasingly available. And, you know, I mean, in the old days, you didn't have so much of this. Now it's more available. It's also better quality. And it tells us a lot about heat, but there are some problems with it. The most obvious problem has to do with resolution, how big the pixel is that the infrared or that the satellite image is reporting on. And of course, the better the data, the more expensive the data, the less likely some places will have access to it, arguably. And the reason the size of the pixel matters is because it takes what is already extremely variable. So if you're looking at that map, you can see that there's a lot of variation across the area in temperature, but the pixels kind of, they coarsen that. So I guess my take home comment about this image is surface temperatures vary immensely. how do you come up with an understanding of heat when there's that much spatial variability in the landscape? And this should bring it home even more. This is a photo that I've taken using a very high quality thermal camera. And you're looking at an image that shows just the temperature of the surfaces basically in the house opposite mine, okay? And so you can see as you look at that, the temperatures are varying nearly 40 degrees Celsius. So some places are relatively, you know, low temperature in the 20s down here, over here. And what do they all have in common? They're vegetation related, right? And then others, this is a bitumen road, not surprisingly. That's a bit hotter. Who wants to guess what this is? No, it's not concrete. Artificial turf, fake grass, 54 degrees Celsius. Yeah, right? Now, the size of that image is it's just the front of a couple of houses, right? See how much variability there is in temperature over that very small spatial scale. So how do you, like, the thing about temperature is it's so incredibly spatially variable. And I'm not talking about temporal variability here, just spatially variable from one surface to another. And that's because things like remote sensing and these heat cameras, they're measuring surface temperature. And this introduces another issue. Is the surface temperature what we want to know? And the answer is probably no, because the surface temperature isn't the temperature we experience when we live in the city. In a city, we experience what we feel is the air temperature. The air temperature is affected by the surface temperature. So that grass, if you're over there on that grass, it's heating you up. And part of that's radiant energy from the surface. And part of it's because the grass itself, the artificial grass, is heating up the air above it. So convection, and that's making the air hot. But the thing about air is it moves around and it mixes. So it doesn't have the same kind of, it doesn't stay in place in the same way the surface does. So although things like remote sensed imagery and thermal cameras are a lot more readily available these days, and they can help us think about heat, they can be very challenging because of the fact that they're not really measuring where we live. So this brings us to different ways that we might measure heat. And this is really simple. If you want to measure what the temperature is outside of the air, you use a thermometer. It's ye olde device that we've used for many years, many years, and that's still what we use. We use a thermometer. And so the image on the right is just a little handheld device that I've used many times to measure heat, to take spot measurements of heat. It's got a little anemometer, which is a wind turbine, measures wind speed and stuff up the top. And then the image on the left is of a permanent weather station in the city of Melbourne that's actually now being closed. But that weather station used to be the place that basically represented temperature in Melbourne. So if you wanted to know what the temperature of Melbourne was, the Bureau of Meteorology would say, this is Melbourne's temperature, and they would read it there, okay? Now, you look at that, and what you can see around it is that it's quite open, that it's sitting on top of grass, and that's deliberate because you need to set your weather station up so that air can move through it. But at the same time, is that actually really representative necessarily of the heat that you're experiencing if you're walking around the city on a hot day? So how do we deal with heat in cities? And I just want to propose that one thing you should think about is using green infrastructure, vegetation. The very concept of the urban heat island tells us that things that have vegetation on them are cooler than things, you know, than human constructed surfaces. And that's because vegetation provides shade. But if it was just shade, then we could just put a big dome over the city and that would help everything, right? But it's more than shade. It's also evapotranspiration. The vegetation is releasing oxygen and moisture into the air during the day, and that's helping to cool the temperatures down. So the image on the right there is right at the front of RMIT. That's the tram stop at the front of RMIT. And you can see the people, there's people waiting for a tram, but where are they waiting? They're sitting under the shade. And you might look at that image and go, wow, that's a hot sunny day. But in actual fact, that entire street is in shade provided by the buildings. But still the coolest place is under the trees. So we want to get more trees into cities. So I don't want to spend any time on this. I just thought I should, talk about some of the things that I've found in various kinds of research that I've done. And one piece of research we did was we looked at park sizes and thinking about how parks can add benefits to cities in terms of cooling. And this is going to sound really obvious. Here's a really, blatant statement. Bigger parks are more beneficial than smaller ones. But the thing is, not a lot of work has actually been done to measure that. And it's because of the variability in temperature, it's actually really difficult to do. And so it's taken a very dedicated research project, a PhD student, to actually go out and do this work. In addition, it doesn't matter if it's summer or winter. The way the park is felt in the city, the distance it cools is the same. So they're seasonally helping it in every season. They're really important. So these are parks in Melbourne, in the city of Melbourne, actually. And in addition, it's not just about the size of the park, but the quality of vegetation within the park. So parks that are just grass don't do as well as parks that have trees in them. Tree canopy cover is incredibly important, and also the evapotranspiration benefits are important. So it's not just the size of the parks, it's also the quality of the parks. So when we're designing urban areas, stick some parks in, and don't just stick in a grassy field, and for goodness sakes, don't put in artificial turf, but don't just make it a natural grass surface. Give it some value by putting in trees, which will have a secondary benefit of providing ecological habitat for organisms in cities. And the other thing about parks is that they're most effective during the day. And I know that sounds obvious, but in fact, one of the biggest things about urban heat has to do with how cities cool down, and when the urban heat island is its most extreme is when parks are doing the most work. So we should be thinking about things like, when we're designing urban areas, get some green into them to help us. And so this is just reinforcing that notion that if you look at the park over time and you look at the maximum temperature in the day, the way the park has its most influence in the hottest times of the day. And that's really, really important. It's the power of evapotranspiration. This is why a park is better than just putting up a shade block, or a tree is better than putting up a shade block. So this is a really neat image of an urban environment in Australia, and you can see the road, and on the left or below the road, there's lots of vegetation. And on the right, above the road, there's not much vegetation. That's what cities look like now as we design them in Melbourne. These new developments all look like the bit on the right. I would much prefer to live on the bit on the left, because the vegetation provides cooling. But we're building bigger houses. We're losing block sizes we're losing private vegetation within cities. And this increases the importance of the public delivery of cool spaces within cities. And just to finish up, the last thing I thought I'd mention is, well, it's all good and well for me to say we should put trees in cities, but you've got to keep them alive. And trees are kind of problematic in cities sometimes, especially in Australia, because everybody complains about the fact that they drop leaves or sometimes drop limbs, which can be very challenging, but they also break up footpaths. And so here's some trees in a very wealthy neighbourhood within Melbourne. And can you see the tiny little bit of green space at the bottom of the tree, which is where it gets its water? And then the tree is desperately looking for resources and water, sending its roots out, and in doing so, cracking the pavement, cracking the road. And so how do we actually both support? And so then the tree can become unstable, it can fall over or, you know, trip over, and then we've got to cut it down. And so how do we keep our trees healthy, but also protect the infrastructure that exists around the tree? And so to ask how trees survive in these places, what we did was we actually dug up trees and looked at their root networks, and it's really interesting. So you'll see that in some places where the tree is really constrained, like number C there, the roots really stay in this very tight little area. And that can actually be used to the benefit of the design by building structural soils, particular pits in the soil that will prevent the tree roots from growing out into the bigger areas. So that was one thing we did. I know Sri's getting antsy, so I'll finish up. Another thing that I'm interested in is how trees use water, because we have this kind of idea that trees are healthy until they die. They're very good at masking when they're in stress, particularly Australian trees, because eucalypts were born to be in stress. They're born to be dry. And so the thing about trees in cities is they can be doing quite well, and then come out and it's too late. The tree's already basically died. So how can we monitor trees, and how can we also use the community to become more invested in supporting their trees? These are sort of questions that were driving some of this research. So this is a tree that I've put an instrument on, a sap flow meter, and it measures how much water the tree uses, but it measures it in real time. So that means it's sending a measurement back every 20 seconds, I think it is. So I've got these measurements of water use over time in the tree. And so these are set up around a park in the middle of Melbourne. And you can see there's just one on the left there. And it's kind of, you know, oh, sorry, I should have said this. It's got a solar panel to make sure that the battery stays, you know, active. And some of them have a signal booster because the place where it's located has a bit of topography. And then it's sending those data to the cloud, essentially. So I've got a number of trees set up with this instrumentation on it. In addition, in the same place, I've set up a weather station. And the weather station and the data node, they're in the same place. All of the data comes in from the trees to this central place, and we're collecting weather data. And what we're trying to do is draw relationships between the environmental conditions, in other words, temperature on a given day, and how trees use water. And people are kind of, they think that trees do okay in cities. But what our work has revealed is that trees spend a lot of time in stress. So I just want to finish by showing you a couple of images. That top image is water use over time for one tree. And so what you'll see is during the day, water use goes up because the tree is thirsty, it's photosynthesizing, it's looking for water to help it photosynthesize. And then at night, it switches to respiration and water use goes down, okay? But then you'll see right in the middle, there's a place where it doesn't drop back down overnight. That's a time of high heat and stress. The tree basically continued to draw water for at least 24 to 48 hours in that period. So that's a tree that needs a drink. And what we want to be able to do is get people to start responding to this kind of variability in trees. The image down the bottom is, I won't actually talk about that. This is just looking at how the water use changes over time. And actually, I'll just, you know, in this tree, which is a fig, so a deciduous tree, what a surprise, no water use in winter, right? But in this tree, which is a eucalypt, there are shifts between seasons and the maximum amount of water use, but eucalypts are drawing water all the time. And one of the things we do in cities is we make water incredibly unavailable for trees. So we could improve our urban forests by just giving them a bit of a drink. Now, one thing that we were hoping to do with this work is take these real-time measurements, send them up to the cloud, and develop an app that we could make available for people who could use it to actually water their own trees out the front of their houses. So the objective is to try and get community to buy in a little bit more to using, to understanding the relationship between trees and heat within cities and the need to keep trees alive. I just thought I'd finish with this image because I don't know if you can see it, but we're out in the bush here and here's some kangaroos. And guess where they're hiding on a hot day? Under the trees. Okay, thanks very much.
Yeah, thank you very much, Mel, Sirin, and Andrew for the lecture today. For the student, is there any questions from you? Oke. Silakan, Mbak. Ada mic-nya nggak?
So thank you so much for the presentations. They were like new insights for us because it's rarely discussed in our class, the things that you were talking about. And I'm Leah. I'm currently a master's student in the urban and regional planning. My questions are to Sirin and maybe Andrew because it's related to Tara. Just last week, we also had a guest lecture from the Queensland University, and we were talking about how important is the informal sectors in, especially in southern planning. And from what I got from your presentation, that data or digital data tends to capture only the formal phenomenon or activity. And my question is, do you think in the future this trend or this system will be more and more neglecting the informal sectors? In this context, I'm talking about the vulnerable community and also the developing country. Or is there any other perspective from you? Thank you. Do you think this trend from the digital data will more neglect the vulnerable community or the developing country in this context, because we are rich from the informal activity and sectors, and digital data tends to capture the formal sectors.
That was stated in Mel and Doreen that too. One was Doreen talking about the fact that we are seeing more data being collected, which effectively formalizes data, but doesn't do it very well. And Mel's example, even though that's true, about people just collecting data themselves that need to be distributed. So I think we do see more of it. We will see more. The question becomes, what uses do it have? So obviously, it's so easy to contemplate data about individuals, communities, people who have that tree up front, or governments. From my perspective, we're very, very likely to see more data within itself effectively formalize what previously. But Serene's point, quite often that very process simply generates and compounds some of those injustices. It makes, by making things visible, it actually kind of leaves some people out.
So I think, yes, I think we want to believe knowing more and having more data is good, because it can be used to inform all sorts of things. I think that's the narrative we live in. The problem is often we come to these data collection exercises with old ideas, and we continue to teach in universities and pretty traditional ideas of collect the data, process the data, analyze the data, so on and so forth. I guess in the context I work in, I've never seen the data become available to everyone. So how has their participation in the process really transformed their lives? So in India, for example, and in Solomon Islands, in some of the communities we work in, they're not really, even though there's this idea that if you live in informal settlements, you'll get evicted. The reality is you don't really, unless you're in a very kind of high volatile areas, which in some parts of Africa you are, and the government is quite dictatorial about it. Lots of informal settlements flourish for generations. And we saw in COVID in India, when it was under shutdown and the informal sector left, many households couldn't survive, but the whole city traded off informal labor. So I think part of the thing is asking not just that we can know it, but should we know it and who gets to know it? So I think there's a real, and this is some of the discussions we're having as well around participatory systems of producing data. When you push comes to shove, we might include communities in it, but we don't actually include communities in the design of it. We rock up and we go, hey, I need you to help me, do this. Then at the end of the day, we don't have state systems that can consume the data, nor do they want to, because they go, I can't verify its accuracy. I can't verify its integrity.
And we don't know what that is.
And, and if I put it in my state system, it means it's legit. And I don't want to know that. Yeah, that's right. So I think until political ideas and social ideas can shift, the tension, I think, is to really understand how you can use projects to work on, to challenge some of those ideas and to show ways forward. But the reality is that the funding of projects never give you time to do them. And so you always have to tell the funder, I'm going to do X, Y, and Z. And then they just hold you to the last full stop, right? That you're going to do that. So it's not possible. You have to spend time with communities. Why would they let you in? Right? Why, you've got to actually go and eat with them and have a cup of tea and spend some time with them and go, okay, I'll tell you what I do with my neck. Like it's not rocket science. So I guess we have a hope that we can know more because it'll drive better decision making. But it's better decision, and this is the thing with democracy. We're trying to trade off the needs of the majority, with kind of the minority. But but that minority never had a voice to start. So there's kind of all these things that come into play that because we teach you also in disciplines, and these things cross disciplinary boundaries, the things you kind of only understand as you get out there and work in these things. But I think if you can at least have a sense that to be cautious and to be nosy and to not take things lying down at face value, I think that's a really good place to start. Just approach everything quite critically and go, why do I want that data? Or why are you collecting that data? What are you like, just always ask why, right? Pretend you're a 6-year-old and go, why am I doing this? Why are you doing this? What's the purpose? Are we just doing this because we can, which is actually the most common response. I cannot tell you how many projects I've seen that will fly a drone because we can't fly a drone. And it's just like, we don't need to fly a drone. It just looks fun, like, that's it. I don't know the answer to your question.
There any other questions from the student? I think the point here is really important about the critical thinking about the data analysis or something, because currently we have access to lots of data, technology, etc. But as Andrew and also Sirin mentioned before, it's really important for us, especially students and also the scholars, to rethink about the implication of the data analysis, result, etc. Especially the justice and also ethical implication of that. Is there any other questions? Welcome, Puyani.
Actually, I
Maybe
don't know, I
from
didn't know
this.
what kind of development are you guys studying? This can be all
What kind
sorts
of
of development.
development?
I just assumed it was development as I understood it, which is terrible. But what does the word signify?
Sorry, I just first of all, sorry, I I miss a lot. I just finished another class in undergraduate program, and the development in this class is actually basically covering aspects of what is happening after planning, because here they are learning about how to make a good planning. But then usually what happened in the reality is that many limitations or many yeah issues that makes the planning cannot be implemented as
I think from the perspective of today, the idea that we know, kind of know what plans generally tend to look like, and we know they don't always come, they're not implemented. And that's not a particular phenomenon in nature, it's a global phenomenon. The question then is always like people do the wrong thing, or even at the other end, people do the wrong thing, you know. And there's so from a data management point of view, whether it's about land industry data or sort of stuff Mel and I were talking about, like how to kind of just measure things we want to change or things should change. The critical question still got to become what would make that sufficient evidence to make decisions with, and who would be in the decision, what would be their motives and incentives to try and follow that. That's kind of, again, that's a question beyond the information. But I know that planning students tend to think that they have all this information, have a good plan, but that's not the end of the job.
yeah.
It's frustrating. I think there's another step up that might get someone to do a lot of this thing. And my years of teaching things often frustrating. But they're kind of, they're quite convinced that the idea is other. So that's frustrating, but I think equally that's the challenge. So to step yourself out and say, why is it that other people aren't seeing this the same way I am? And that's not a data problem.
Yeah.
But
Yeah.
data could be a trigger if people differently or
Yeah.
that's data as a tool to have that conversation, not a piece of information.
Yeah.
Kind of meet people.
I think when I guess I see the communities kind of who sit in that space where plans haven't worked the way it should, right? Because they're very informal, and a lot of that is about the lack of adequate housing. So I think part of it is there's kind of a lot of there's one side of it where formalizing informal settlements means they have a chance at compensation, for example, when land acquisition happens as the city develops. So that's often talked about in those terms as an incentive. But I think what is really tricky as well is that a lot of large infrastructure, like I guess I'll speak from in the Indian context because it's the one I know more about, is that a lot of large infrastructure will happen like extension of railway lines, expansion of railway lines. They're all already on government-owned land. And those lands are where the former settlements happen.
Mm.
So they don't actually have a right of compensation. They can't be formal.
Oh.
So part of it, and then they try to displace people, move them to
Mm.
houses, to
Mm.
high-rise. And it doesn't work because it doesn't understand the logic of their lives.
Mm.
And so kind of there's a logic to living that's about their life circumstances.
Mhm.
And I don't know that plans actually can accommodate that kind of logic.
Mhm.
So I don't know what the answer is, but I guess a lot of the frustration we hear from them is that, well, we need to do this, we want to be near here, you know, we accept, we trade off these poorer conditions because we can have our car here or whatever. So there's a lot of that I don't know to what extent you guys think about when you're doing your studies, but it's certainly what I hear from communities. It's that
Mm.
the plans don't match the way we live. And
Mm.
so when there's that tension.
Yeah.
We'll just do what's best for us. And also, you know, when we talk about climate actions, in our communities in Honiara, the waterways are chock full of plastic, right?
Mm.
And when we speak to them, we try not to be, we just kind of go, oh, what's going on here? Why, you know, what's you know, because it's kind of a structural issue, right? It's not that they're just chucking things in. It's
Mm.
because the waste disposal capacity of the city is full. The landfill is full, you know,
Mm.
they know it's bad for the environment, but if it's a choice of
Mm.
where do I put the plastic, chuck it into a river,
Mm.
the environment before, so like, you know, they come to some really simple A and B choices.
Donald Trump says plastics, paper straws explode.
That's right. So we should not use paper straws. So sometimes you have to understand that when we make decisions at strategic levels, they don't mirror the life choices of some of our vulnerable communities. And
Yeah.
that's why things don't work. They understand it. They understand plastic is bad,
Yeah.
but they don't actually have choices.
Yeah.
To follow that kind of thinking.
And that goes to that issue of the data then measuring what people do or what they want to do.
Yeah.
You know,
Mm.
that's the tricky to think about. But all the sort of available data and all the smart city information, everything else, it's like it's telling us what people do, or telling us what they would do.
And,
Hmm.
you know, coming to Mel's stuff with natural resources,
Hmm.
we don't have heuristics for values. We can't count what people value. So we can't measure it. So that is a gap in the data.
Mhm.
You know, we try our best to metricize values, but we can't. Nobody can standardize values, and nobody knows how to. We're very good at the economic stuff, but we don't actually understand how to include kind of an aesthetic value or something in the way we plan for things.
Hmm.
Questions, maybe from.
Another question? Any other questions? Okay, you can use the microphone, Marco.
Once we have the data and we know to be critical about the data, so understanding that values are different, where do we draw the line between how context specific we get and then choosing between acting generally?
Yeah, I know that's tricky, isn't it? And I think because I actually think, I think there's one of the reasons I think there's pretty good value in using things that are institutionally acceptable because they actually get the thing done. Like it's while reflexive, you can go, let's work with people, let's engage and do things that are going to, you know, be really what experiences on the ground. But you work in a system where, you know, some abstracted and some legal efficient things actually is what matters often. So you've got to trade that off about what can get done, I reckon. You've got to then make decisions about what's the sort of what's likely to actually make change, what's the theory of change, right? So maybe that's not right. there's a certain point at which, you know, addressing it probably doing something sometimes. And it's very frustrating. You know, wait, you have basically derived from dealing with local experts stuff all the time. But it's sometimes people think that it can have a like in my experience, he got plenty of not even a chance also critical about not just using information all over that, but make that how I done making sure that's how I do something to do. That's sometimes some official information by getting the rest. That's probably the balance to do that very practice. And
Good question.
it's probably in general.
Are you in a public policy course or are you in a planning course? Sorry? Planning.
Okay, so some lessons to be learned about how you maintain that.
I think it depends who your master is, what you have to do, who pays your paycheck, and what's the appetite?
The window you've got
Yeah.
today.
What's the appetite for change? There's no, sometimes you've got to work, you've got to understand the limitations of the data, but you also have to understand what's the appetite for radical action. And often there's no appetite for radical action. So you've got to build your campaign incrementally.
It feels like the more we are critically kind of like looking back at our data collection, it almost feels like in the end we know we have to do better, but then we just fall back on it. Oh, we can't implement.
Yeah. I suppose that's all about cost of time too. I suppose my main argument would be to say, kind of just stuff like that. We just realise that other ways that aren't really data ways to make it. Yeah. I think people overly rely on some spatial data set. Probably just judgment possibly better. Think about how we make this, like we make this more or less knowledge or more or less judgment or something. It's like just guessing. This is some of the way I see data with their sometimes.
Well, changing to a new topic, okay. Talking about dilemma, that I agree with your statement that the more urbanized area, meaning that the more activity there, more activity will enrich the heat there. So the more activity, the more heat. But we know that all of the people do their activity in the urban area or in the city, they don't live there. They live even in urban fringe or hinterland or even in satellite city outside the city, right? So basically, I'm going to ask about your opinion. If there is a problem about the heat in a urban caused by lack of green spaces there, but in other hand, we have the problem about housing there, affordable housing specifically. So which one should be prioritized according to your opinion? Because we know that those problems is actually, I think it's equally important for people. Let's take example in Jakarta. The latest survey says that people in Jakarta tend to have a house there compared to have a park. So do you think we should follow what people want there? Or as a scientist, we know that solving the heat problem in urban or in the cities is more important than the housing or affordable housing problem. Thank you.
So, it's possible to do both, right? It's possible now to design more sensibly than we used to, right? Now, I'm talking about, I appreciate that I'm talking about, you know, both a will to do that, but also economic circumstances that has to allow that. But we can design buildings, we can design spaces better than we used to. Actually, in some respects, it's even reverting back to how we used to, because, you know, there's a lot of knowledge of people who've lived in hot areas for a long time who didn't build little boxes, but who lived differently in the landscape. So the problem, though, is that in well-built cities, that's a lot harder. You can't really, you could retrofit some things, but not much, right? So the easiest, like the low-hanging fruit, easiest thing to do in a city is to think about water and vegetation. It's really, because you have public space, you can talk about that in public space, right? But it is a compromise of space, and your government has or the, you know, the decision makers will have an agenda, and that agenda will be driven by their particular circumstances. So it's coming back to Serene's conversation around very spatially specific kinds of possibilities. And I am realistic enough to say that it's easy to say vegetation should be in cities. And in fact, many cities around here do it much better than we do it in Melbourne, because vegetation grows quite easily here, whereas in Melbourne it's hard to grow because it's dry. But you know, you have to be realistic that can't necessarily, well, you certainly shouldn't be forcing people out of homes in order to redesign the city to grow vegetation. But here's my problem. When Jakarta's 60 degrees outside, and it's going to get there, right? When those kinds of days happen, then what's going on? You know, then how are people in the city feeling?
Good in your capital.
Well, this is the thing. Will people start to flee the city? Will that lead to the city being reclaimed? Like, it's a really interesting concept. But of course, the problem with that is, where do those people go? They go into the rural areas. Then we see buildings going up, pulling down vegetation and encroaching on agricultural land, so then you can't feed. It's a very broad, like, you're asking a great question, an impossible question to answer. My short response on it is, I guess my take home is, it is not doing an urban population any good to pretend this isn't a problem.
I think
So how do you, you're going to need to do something. So maybe vegetation isn't the answer for your location, but if you don't deal with that, you're going to have deaths, a human toll in the urban landscape, and that is no good for anybody's elected.
Can I ask one thing you asked the question, well, you didn't touch on, maybe you know something about. You're asking about transport, people think about it, people think about it. What do we know about transport implications of urban heat? Like, particularly motor transport, like what share of it? You know,
It's
Think about
not,
this.
yeah, its role is very much so it's got a dual role. It releases emissions that traffic.
Yeah.
So it plays a role there, and then it contributes to greenhouse gas emissions more broadly that are increasing global temperatures. So if you could have a city that didn't use gas vehicles, you know, CO2 emitting vehicles, you would definitely be better off, because
But
you're
it's
really
also huge amounts of flat surface to run the system on.
That's right. So you can they design roads now out of different kinds of materials that don't absorb heat, but reflect it. So you can, like, if you think about cities, older buildings in, say, Greek cities, there's a reason why they're all white, right? Yet you come to Melbourne and all our roofs are flat. So a very simple notion would be, don't make the roofs flat because it absorbs so much heat, right? A very simple idea. Why do we make them flat? Because it looks a bit better. And who's up there looking down on your roof anyway? I don't know. But I mean, there's some really silly decision making that could be easily changed to redress some of these problems. Kind of question you're asking, that's not an easy, that's something I hope you'll go out and solve, but it's not an easy, it's a great question to ask. Yeah, and it's about trade-off compromise, and I'm quite trite, because I said at the start, I basically said I don't care about big, right, when I started the conversation. And that's totally unrealistic, because you can't do that. Yeah.
Interesting. And especially when we talk about development management, it also will be influenced by the power, who will have the power and what are their priorities. For example, are they going to prioritizing the needs for housing, or for also balancing with the environment, or which one?
Hello. Yeah. My question is specifically for Dr. Melissa. So, first of all, interesting presentation. It was very insightful. And as you were presenting, I've been trying to put your topics into context. Like for example, like in this city, have you heard of the term kampung kota? It basically means urban village. So yeah, and yeah, basically yeah, we have lots of that in this city, and not most, like some are still considered as informal settlements. And yeah, given these challenges, my question is, are existing urban heat island mitigation strategies adaptable for informal settlements like the city's kampung kota, where formal planning regulations and cooling infrastructure are often lacking?
I mean, there's a yes and a no. I mean, the more formal, highly designed engineering solutions aren't going to work, right? But realistically, you can grow a tree anywhere, right?
Yeah.
So in that sense, you could promote and I would assume it that in a lot of informal settlements that I've been involved with around, around the world, that people live differently to how we design the major city centre, right? And there's a lot of activity that Serene talked about that happens outdoors already. And so the outside space, in a way, is valued more in informal settlements than it is in like in Melbourne, for example, where we just get rid of all the vegetation outside and everybody lives in a big house. And so there is immense potential to kind of help support that, I guess. I think the more formal engineering design structure, I mean, they can provide benefits for everybody. And the other thing is that even helping the city centre away from the informal settlements, remember the park cooling will also affect and impact the heat around those settlements as well. So there'll be benefits that flow from outside their area.
So there are like direct and indirect
That's
effects of
exactly
the,
right. Yeah, so indirect benefits. But I think there's immense potential in those sorts of areas because of the better appreciation of outdoor, the not needing the buildings quite the same way that we do.
so like we don't really have to like change anything with the informal settlements, but like change the environment around it, so it has like the indirect effect
Yeah, yeah.
Basically.
So that could be the more formal role that planning plays
Yeah.
without directly intervening into the formal settlement, which, you know, Serena has talked about is not necessarily. A, it's not going to be successful, but B, there's all sorts of power imbalances around engaging. But again, those communities are extremely vulnerable as well to increasing heat. And one of the things is how people cool down. Where can they go to get?
I'll just add very quickly to this. So in Honiara, which is the capital city of Solomon Islands, the informal settlements have always been the coolest part of the city. But that started to change, that is changing because tin roofs are seen as a status. So they're replacing thatch roofs with tin roofs. But also when the government tried to green the road, there's a major road. When you walk down the street now, you'll see all the trees are chopped to bits because of the need for firewood to cook. So you need to sometimes chase the chain of consequences, you know, and understand, you know, even if you have the best intentions of greening the road so that it has kind of convection impacts. You know, it's something as simple as I don't have access to wood to cook. So I'm gonna chop the street tree down. And that's it, you know.
It's all about
Yeah,
adjusting.
it's gone. Then your plan is toast. So you really need to try to understand what drives life, what drives the pattern of the city. Because yeah, for us, we were just like, oh, you know, we keep getting engaged in conversations about master planning for the city, but there's so many things that end up in that ecosystem of decisions. That it's very, very complicated. Yeah.
So we have to talk to you later. In class 30.
Sorry, Andrew?
So I'm happy to talk to anyone. I think we're finishing.
Yes,
Yeah.
yes.
To anyone, so. Yeah.
Yeah. If anyone would like to discuss further about the topic that Andrew, Sirin, and also Mel already presented, please just come to them after this class. Yeah. Is there any wrap up from you, Yani? No? Okay. Okay. I think there is a brief kind of closing remark for me. So three of the lecturers today kind of provide very interesting insight into a kind of data and then also data analysis and then how we critically can use that data analysis. Andrew is kind of giving a very broad overview about the smart city, different types of data that we can collect and we can analyze, and then how the implication for the policy. So Andrew highlight about the kind of policy driven from the data analysis, something like that. And then Sirin also highlight the justice aspect of the land data management, right? Provide a kind of a brief introduction about what is data management, land data management here. So I think it's kind of interesting that. And also the last one is Mel here highlighted that we should also consider the non-human agent right here. So because environment is kind of maybe we can see environment is different from human or social aspect here, but actually if we really care of the environment, like providing more green space, greening in the city, actually we also can improve the livelihood of the people that living in the city as well. So we talk about non-human, but actually the benefit is also can be for human or the society as well. Yeah, I think that's all for today. Thank you very much for the student that already participate in this class. So hopefully the lectures today can be a kind of a good opening for this class. And then is there any further information for the class?
Okay. First of all, on behalf of the teaching team of this development management course, I would like to thank you. I would like to thank Andrew, Syrian, and also Mel for the thought-provoking presentations. Also, I missed all of those presentations, but I'm sure that it was thought-provoking because of the discussions. Thank you very much once again. And thank you also, Bu Antung, for moderating the session. And thanks everyone for the fruitful discussion. I hope, the discussions can be one of the opening eye of yours for our course later. We will have our first introduction of the course next week. So you will meet with Prof. Bobby and I. So we will see you in separate class, yeah, for regular class. It will be on Tuesday and double degree class on Thursday next week. We also have a token of appreciation for the three of our guest lecturers. Once again, thank you very much. So one by one, maybe Bu Antung can also join. Maybe you can open it. And you can also wear it.
Yeah, beautiful. Very nice. It's better than hat. Thanks, guys, for the questions and for your participation with the content.
Okay, thank you once again, everyone. Thank you also to those who are joining online. Yeah, thanks. Terima kasih Pak Eko. Okay.